Wyoming Territory, 1887. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek, when a voice no bigger than a whisper stopped Marshal Jake Thornton, dead in his tracks. Behind the crooked wooden fence of the orphanage, a pair of wide blue eyes peered through the gaps, and tiny fingers gripped the weathered planks like a prisoner behind bars. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy? Just for one day?" Jake's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. In 15 years of wearing a badge, he'd faced down cattle rustlers, bank robbers, and claim jumpers, but nothing had ever hit him quite like those 7 words from a child who couldn't be more than 6 years old. The coffee in his tin cup grew cold as he stared into those hopeful blue eyes, and for a moment, the harsh Wyoming wind seemed to still around them. The year was 1887, and the American frontier was still wild and unforgiving. Towns like Willow Creek sprouted up like tumbleweeds wherever the railroad decided to stop, filled with dreamers, drifters, and those running from something they'd rather forget. The town sat in a valley between rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and wild grass, where cattle grazed under the endless blue sky, and the nearest city was 3 days' hard ride through territory that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Marshal Jake Thornton was a bit of all 3 types of frontier folk: dreamer, drifter, and runner. At 32, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than under a roof. His dark hair was perpetually tousled by the Wyoming wind, and his green eyes held the kind of wariness that came from seeing too much too young. The silver star pinned to his leather vest was about the only thing that stayed polished in his life. He'd come to Willow Creek 3 years ago, carrying nothing but a worn saddle, a reliable horse named Thunder, and secrets he kept locked away, tighter than the town's bank vault. The previous marshal had been gunned down by rustlers, and the town council was desperate enough to pin the badge on anyone willing to wear it. Jake had been willing, though his reasons were his own. The orphanage sat at the edge of town like a lonely sentinel, a 2-story wooden building that had seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls like old skin, and the porch sagged under the weight of too many Wyoming winters. It housed nearly 20 children, all victims of the harsh realities of frontier life: Indian raids, disease, wagon accidents, mining disasters, and parents who simply couldn't feed another mouth. Jake had been making his morning rounds, checking on Old Pete's saloon, making sure the Henderson's general store was still locked up tight, and ensuring that the railroad depot was secure, when the small voice stopped him cold. Now, standing there with his coffee growing cold in his hand, he found himself staring down at the most serious little face he'd ever seen. The child was a girl, maybe 6 or 7, with cornflower blue eyes and hair the color of wheat that hung in 2 neat braids down her back. Her dress was clean but patched in several places, and her shoes were clearly too big for her feet. Hand-me-downs from an older child, no doubt. But it was her expression that caught him, old beyond her years, like she'd already learned that the world wasn't a fairy tale, and that happy endings were reserved for other people. "What's your name, little miss?" Jake asked, crouching down to her level so he could look her in the eye properly. "Evangeline," she whispered, never taking her eyes off his face. "But most folks just call me Evie." "Well, Miss Evie, that's a mighty serious question you just asked me. Mind if I ask why?" Evie glanced back toward the orphanage, where Jake could see other children moving about inside. Some were hanging sheets on the line in the backyard. Others were sweeping the front porch, and through the windows he could see the smallest ones being tended to by the older girls. "Today's the day families come to look at us," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone much older. "Mrs. Hartwell says we need to be on our best behavior, and that maybe some of us will find homes. She's been cooking all morning, and she made us all take extra baths and put on our Sunday clothes." Jake's heart clenched. He'd heard about these days from Doc Morrison and Reverend Walsh, when prospective parents would come to the orphanage to choose a child, like picking apples from a tree. It was a practical arrangement in a harsh land where every extra pair of hands was needed, and where love was often a luxury people couldn't afford. Children were chosen for their ability to work, their health, their potential usefulness. But Jake had never thought about what it felt like from the child's perspective. "And you think having a daddy with you would help?" he asked gently. Evie nodded solemnly, her small hand still gripping the fence slats. "All the other children talk about their mamas and papas before they came here, Tommy remembers his pa teaching him to whittle. Lucy talks about how her mama used to sing to her, but I never had any to remember. I've been here since I was real little. Mrs. Hartwell says my mama and papa died when their wagon turned over in the creek, and I was the only one who lived. She paused, looking down at her worn shoes. I thought maybe if I had a papa, even just for pretend, someone might want me too. All the families that come, they ask the children about their folks, about where they came from. And when I say I don't remember nothing, they get that look in their eyes like I'm broken somehow. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He looked at this little girl with her earnest face and careful braids, and something inside his chest cracked open. Her small world had taught her that she needed to be more than herself to be worthy of love, and that broke his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Evie, sweetheart, he said, reaching through the fence to gently touch her small hand. Families don't choose children because of who they've got with them. They choose them because of who they are. And you're pretty special just as you are. That's what Mrs. Hartwell says, Evie replied, but her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. But I've been here longer than most anybody. 3 whole years that I can remember, and Mrs. Hartwell says even longer than that. And nobody's ever picked me. I watch them come and go, and they always choose somebody else. 3 years. Jake tried to imagine this little girl, even smaller then, watching other children leave with new families while she stayed behind. Always the bridesmaid, never the bride. The thought made his jaw tighten and his hands clench into fists. Well, he said slowly, the decision forming in his mind even as he spoke, I reckon I don't have anything pressing to do today. If Mrs. Hartwell doesn't mind, maybe I could stick around for a while. But I want you to understand something first. You don't need me or anybody else to make you special. You already are special, all on your own. Evie's eyes went wide, and, for the first time since he'd been talking to her, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. You mean it? You'll really pretend to be my daddy? I mean it, Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. But we better go ask permission first. Can't have the town marshal breaking rules now, can we? The little girl giggled, actually giggled, and the sound was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Come on, she said, releasing the fence and running toward the front door. Mrs. Hartwell's in the kitchen with Mrs. Murphy, getting everything ready. Jake followed, his spurs jingling softly with each step. As they walked up the sagging porch steps, he could smell the aroma of fresh bread and apple pie drifting from the kitchen. Someone had swept the porch clean and arranged wildflowers in mason jars on the windowsills. The orphanage might be poor, but it was clear that Mrs. Hartwell was doing her best to make it feel like a home. Mrs. Hartwell turned out to be a sturdy woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She wore a flour-dusted apron over a simple brown dress, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with them every day. Beside her stood a younger woman, Mrs. Murphy, Jake assumed, who was helping arrange cookies on a platter. Mrs. Hartwell, Evie called out, tugging on the woman's skirt. This is Marshal Thornton, and he wants to be my papa for today. Mrs. Hartwell looked surprised, her eyebrows rising nearly to her hairline. She glanced from Evie to Jake and back again, taking in the hopeful expression on the little girl's face and the slightly bewildered look on the marshal's. Is that so? She said carefully. Marshal Thornton, might I have a word with you privately? Jake nodded, and Mrs. Hartwell led him to a small office off the main hallway. The room was cramped but tidy, with a desk covered in papers, a bookshelf filled with ledgers, and a single window that looked out over the town. She closed the door and turned to face him. Marshal, I appreciate your kindness to Evie, but I have to ask, what exactly do you think you're doing? Jake removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. To tell you the truth, ma'am, I'm not entirely sure. That little girl asked me a question that just about broke my heart, and before I knew it, I was saying yes. I know it sounds foolish. It doesn't sound foolish, Mrs. Hartwell interrupted, her expression softening. It sounds kind, but you need to understand what you're getting into. These adoption days are emotional for all the children, but especially for Evie. She's been passed over so many times. and each time it gets a little harder for her to bounce back. She told me she's been here 3 years. Longer than that, actually. She came to us when she was barely 2 years old. Her parents were traveling through on their way to California when their wagon overturned trying to cross Willow Creek during the spring flood. Both parents drowned, but little Evie was thrown clear and found clinging to a tree branch downstream. She nearly died herself from the cold water. Jake felt his chest tighten. She doesn't remember them at all? Not a thing. And that makes her different from most of the other children here. They have memories, stories to tell about their families. Evie has nothing but what we've been able to give her, and I'm afraid that makes some families see her as, well, as damaged goods. The phrase hit Jake like a slap. She's not damaged. She's just a little girl who deserves a family. I agree completely. But not everyone sees it that way. Mrs. Hartwell studied his face for a long moment. Marshal Thornton, I've known you for 3 years now and you're a good man. If you want to spend the day with little Evie, I don't see the harm. But I have to warn you, there are 6 families coming today, and they'll all be looking for the right child to take home. And at the end of the day, you'll be going back to your life, and she'll still be here. Can you handle that? More importantly, can she? Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about the little girl with the serious eyes and the careful braids. I can't promise it won't be hard, ma'am, but I can promise that for today she'll have someone in her corner. Someone who thinks she's pretty special, just as she is. Mrs. Hartwell's expression softened completely. She is special, Marshal. She's one of the sweetest children I've ever known. She helps with the younger ones, never complains about chores, and has never given me a moment's trouble. She reads to the little ones at bedtime, shares her dessert with anyone who's feeling sad, and once walked 3 miles in the snow to bring medicine to the widow Peterson when she was sick. Then why hasn't anyone chosen her? Mrs. Hartwell sighed. Because she's small for her age, and families need workers. Because she's quiet and serious instead of bubbly and charming. Because she asks thoughtful questions that make some adults uncomfortable. And because she doesn't have the tragic but romantic story that tugs at heartstrings. Her parents aren't war heroes or pioneer legends. They were just ordinary people who died in an ordinary accident. Jake felt his jaw clench again. Well, maybe. It's time someone saw her for who she really is instead of what she can do for them. I hope so, Marshal. I truly do. But remember, at the end of the day, you're not really her father. Don't make promises you can't keep. When they returned to the kitchen, they found Evie helping Mrs. Murphy arrange flowers, her small face serious with concentration. She looked up when they entered, and Jake could see the anxiety in her eyes. Is it all right? She asked quietly. Can Marshal Thornton really be my papa today? Yes, dear, Mrs. Hartwell said gently. But remember what we talked about. This is just for today. Marshal Thornton has his own life and his own responsibilities. I know, Evie said solemnly. I won't get confused about it, I promise. But Jake could see the hope shining in her eyes despite her serious words, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The first family arrived just after 10 o'clock, their buggy raising a cloud of dust as it rolled up to the orphanage. The Millers were in their 30s, well-dressed and serious-looking. Mr. Miller owned a successful farm about 20 miles out of town, and his wife managed their household with the efficiency of a military commander. They had lost their only child to scarlet fever 2 years ago and were looking for a replacement, someone old enough to help with chores but young enough to adapt to their ways. Jake watched from the parlor as Mrs. Hartwell introduced them to several children. The room had been tidied for the occasion, with the best furniture arranged to show the space to its advantage. Wildflowers in mason jars brightened the windowsills, and the wooden floors had been scrubbed until they gleamed. Evie sat beside him on the horsehair sofa, her small hand tucked trustingly into his larger one. She was quiet, but Jake could feel the tension in her little body as the Millers looked over the assembled children like they were shopping for livestock at the county fair. This is Marcus, Mrs. Hartwell was saying, introducing a boy of about 10 with sandy hair and freckles. He's very good with animals and has been helping with our chickens and the milk cow. Mrs. Miller nodded approvingly. Can he read and write? Yes, ma'am. Marcus is one of our best students. They moved on to a girl named Patience, who was 12 and known for her skill with a needle. Then came the twins, Ruth and Rebecca, who were 8 and inseparable. Finally, Mrs. Hartwell reached Jake and Evie. "And this is Evangeline," Mrs. Hartwell said when she reached them. "She's 7 years old and very helpful with the younger children. She reads to them at bedtime and helps them with their letters." Mrs. Miller looked Evie up and down with a critical eye, taking in her small stature and serious expression. "She's rather small for 7, isn't she? We need a child who can pull her weight on the farm. The work is hard and there's no room for slackers." Jake felt his temper flare, but before he could respond, Evie spoke up in her small, clear voice. "I'm stronger than I look, ma'am. I can carry 2 buckets of water from the well, and I help Mrs. Hartwell with the washing every Monday. I may be little, but I work real hard." "That's admirable, child," Mr. Miller said, though his tone was dismissive. "But we need someone who can handle heavy farm work. Milking cows, feeding pigs, hauling hay. I'm afraid you're just too small." "Evie's got other qualities that are just as valuable," Jake found himself saying, rising from the sofa. "She's got a good heart, and she's smart as a whip. She can read better than most adults I know, and she's got more common sense than kids twice her age." Mr. Miller raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Jake Thornton," he said, offering his hand. "I'm Evie's. Well, I'm here with her today." The lie came easier than he'd expected, and he saw Evie's face light up with something that might have been hope. "I see," Mrs. Miller said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely approve. She looked from Jake to Evie and back again, clearly, trying to figure out the relationship. "Well, we were hoping for a child without complications." "What kind of complications?" Jake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Well, if she has family nearby, there might be interference, divided loyalties. We need a child who will be completely devoted to our family." Jake felt his hands clench into fists, but before he could respond, Evie squeezed his hand and spoke up again. "It's all right, Papa Jake," she said, and the word Papa hit Jake right in the chest like a physical blow. "They probably need someone bigger anyway. I understand." The quiet dignity in her voice made Jake's throat tight. Here was a 7-year-old child handling rejection with more grace than most adults he knew. "That's very understanding of you, sweetheart," he managed to say. The Millers moved on to look at other children, spending considerable time with Marcus and eventually settling on him. The boy seemed pleased with the arrangement, and Jake was happy for him, even as he felt sorry for the children, who would once again be passed over. The second family arrived just as the Millers were completing their paperwork. The Hendersons were a young couple in their early 20s who seemed more interested in finding a pretty little girl to dress up than in finding a working member of their household. Mrs. Henderson cooed over several of the younger girls, admiring their hair and complexion as if they were dolls in a shop window. "Oh, look at this one," she exclaimed when she reached a 4-year-old named Melody with golden curls and big brown eyes. "Isn't she just precious?" Melody giggled and twirled, clearly enjoying the attention. Mrs. Henderson knelt down and began asking her questions in a sing-song voice, as if she were talking to a pet rather than a child. When they reached Evie, Mrs. Henderson barely glanced at her. "She's too serious," she whispered to her husband, though not quite quietly enough. "I want a child who smiles more, someone cheerful and bright." Jake felt Evie's hand tighten in his, and he squeezed back reassuringly. "Some folks just don't know quality when they see it," he murmured to her, and was rewarded with a small smile. The Hendersons eventually chose Melody, who seemed thrilled to be going home with the pretty lady, who promised her new dresses and hair ribbons. As they left with their new daughter, Jake couldn't help but wonder if they had any idea what they were really taking on, or if they would still find the child charming when she had a tantrum or wet her bed. The third family, the Washingtons, were older and looking for a child to help care for Mrs. Washington's elderly mother, who lived with them. They needed someone mature and responsible, someone who could help with nursing duties and wouldn't be frightened by the sometimes confused ramblings of an old woman with a failing mind. They spent most of their time talking to the 12 and 13-year-olds, eventually settling on a quiet girl named Hope, who had been caring for her own grandmother before the old woman's death brought her to the orphanage. By the time the fourth family arrived, Jake could see the hope slowly draining from Evie's eyes. She was putting on a brave face, but he could tell each rejection was wearing on her like water wearing away stone. She sat a little straighter each time a new family arrived, tried to smile a little brighter, but with each passing hour she seemed to shrink a little more into herself. The fourth family was the Garcias, recent immigrants from Mexico who spoke limited English and seemed to be looking for a child who could help them navigate life in their new country. They needed someone old, enough to translate and help with business in town, but young enough to learn and adapt alongside them. They were kind people, but their needs were specific, and they eventually chose a boy named Miguel who spoke fluent Spanish and had been helping translate for other families. Jake found himself hoping desperately that the remaining families would see what he saw when he looked at Evie, a bright, kind, resilient little girl who deserved a chance at happiness. The fifth family was the Caldwells, and Jake could tell immediately that they were different from the others. They were in their 40s, and there was something about the way they carried themselves that spoke of genuine kindness rather than mere practicality. Mr. Caldwell was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands that spoke of honest labor. His wife was shorter and rounder, with laugh lines around her eyes and a gentle way of moving that reminded Jake of his own mother, long buried in a cemetery back in Missouri. They took time to actually talk to each child, asking about their interests and dreams rather than just their size or usefulness. They spoke to Tommy about his whittling, admired Rebecca's drawings, and listened patiently as young Peter told them about his pet grasshopper. When they reached Evie, Mrs. Caldwell knelt down to her level, just as Jake had done that morning by the fence. "Hello, dear. What's your name?" "Evangeline," Evie said quietly, but Jake noticed she sat up a little straighter. "But most folks call me Evie." "That's a beautiful name. Do you know what it means?" Evie shook her head, clearly intrigued. "It means good news," Mrs. Caldwell said with a warm smile. "In the old stories, an evangelist was someone who brought good news to people. I think that's a lovely thing to be named after, don't you?" For the first time all day, Evie smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face like sunrise over the mountains. "I didn't know that. I like it." "Well, now you do, and I think it suits you. You have a face that looks like good news." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "And who is this gentleman with you?" "This is Papa Jake," Evie said, and again Jake felt that punch to the chest. "He's my daddy." Mrs. Caldwell looked at Jake with interest, taking in his marshal's badge and weathered appearance. "Your daughter is lovely, Mr. Thornton," Jake said, standing and offering his hand. "Jake Thornton. And thank you, ma'am. I think she's pretty special myself." "Are you from around here, Mr. Thornton?" "I'm the town marshal," Jake said, which wasn't exactly an answer to her question but seemed to satisfy her curiosity. Mrs. Caldwell spent several more minutes talking with Evie, asking about her favorite colors, blue like the big sky over Wyoming, her favorite animals, horses, though she'd never ridden one, and what she wanted to be when she grew up. "I'm not sure," Evie said thoughtfully. "Maybe a teacher like Miss Patterson at the schoolhouse so I can help children learn to read. Or maybe a nurse like Mrs. Doc Morrison so I can help people feel better when they're sick. I like helping people." "Those are wonderful dreams," Mrs. Caldwell said warmly. "The world needs more people who want to help others." "What about you?" Evie asked, with the directness that only children possess. "What do you and Mr. Caldwell do?" "We have a small ranch about an hour's ride from here," Mrs. Caldwell explained. "We raise horses mostly, and we have a few cattle. It's not a big operation, but we love the work, and we have a good school nearby with a wonderful teacher who I think you'd like very much." "Do you have children?" Evie asked. Mrs. Caldwell's expression grew sad for a moment. "We did. A little boy named David. But he got sick with pneumonia 3 winters ago and went to be with the angels." We've been hoping to find another child to love and share our home with." Evie was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to everything. "I'm sorry about David," she said finally. "That must have made you very sad." "It did," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice soft. "But you know." "What?" "I think David would have liked you very much. He loved stories and books just like you do." When the Caldwells moved on to meet other children, Jake could see something different in Mrs. Caldwell's eyes. She kept glancing back at Evie, and there was a quality to her attention that hadn't been there with the other families. Jake found himself hoping, really hoping, that they might be the ones. The sixth and final family was the Stewarts, an elderly couple who seemed more interested in having a quiet companion for their twilight years than in raising a child. They wanted someone very young and biddable, someone who would sit quietly and not cause trouble. They spent most of their time with the youngest children, eventually choosing a shy 5-year-old named Grace, who barely spoke above a whisper. As the afternoon wore on and the families began making their decisions, Jake watched Evie's shoulders slump a little more with each passing hour. She maintained her brave front, but he could see the disappointment building in her eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The Caldwells spent a long time in discussion with Mrs. Hartwell, glancing occasionally toward the parlor, where Jake and Evie waited. Jake found himself holding his breath, hoping against hope that they would choose her. There was something about them, a warmth, a gentleness, that made him think they would be good parents to any child lucky enough to be chosen by them. Finally, Mrs. Hartwell approached them, her face carefully neutral in the way of adults who didn't want to get a child's hopes up before they knew for certain. "Evie, dear, could you come with me for a moment? The Caldwells would like to speak with you." Evie looked up at Jake with wide eyes, hope and fear warring in her expression. "Will you come with me, Papa Jake?" "Of course, sweetheart." They followed Mrs. Hartwell to the small office where the Caldwells waited. The space felt even more cramped with 5 adults and 1 small child, but somehow the Caldwells' presence made it feel warmer rather than crowded. "Evie," Mrs. Caldwell said gently, "we've talked to a lot of children today, and you've made quite an impression on us." Evie's hand found Jake's again and she squeezed tight, as if she could anchor herself to his strength. "We'd like to know how you feel about coming home with us," Mr. Caldwell continued, his voice warm and kind. "We have a small ranch about an hour's ride from here like Martha told you. We raise horses mostly and we have a good school nearby. We think you'd like it there." For a moment, Evie was completely still, as if she was afraid to breathe for fear of breaking the spell. Then she looked up at Jake with an expression that broke his heart. "But what about Papa Jake? Would he come too?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, heavy and significant. Jake felt every eye in the room on him, and he realized he was at a crossroads he hadn't seen coming. He'd started the day thinking he was doing a simple kindness, but somewhere along the way, this little girl had worked her way into his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Mrs. Caldwell looked confused, glancing between Jake and Evie. "I'm sorry, dear, but I thought, isn't Mr. Thornton your father?" "He's my pretend daddy," Evie said in a small voice, her eyes downcast. "Just for today, because I thought maybe if I had a papa, someone might want me." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake could see the understanding dawning on the Caldwells' faces, the realization that this man they'd assumed was her father was actually a stranger who had volunteered to spend a day pretending to be something he wasn't. He braced himself for their reaction, expecting disappointment or even anger at the deception. But instead of anger or disappointment, Mrs. Caldwell's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, reaching out to gently touch Evie's cheek. "You thought we wanted you because you had a daddy with you?" Evie nodded, her own eyes beginning to shimmer with unshed tears. "Darling girl, we want you because you're you. Because when I asked you what you wanted to be when you grew up, you said maybe a teacher because you want to help children learn, or maybe a nurse because you want to help people feel better. Because when that little boy was crying earlier, you went and sat with him until he felt better. Because you asked about our son David and told us you were sorry he died, even though you'd never met him. Because you have the biggest heart I've ever seen in such a small person." "Really?" Evie's voice was barely a whisper, as if she was afraid to believe it. Really? Mr. Caldwell confirmed, his own voice rough with emotion. We don't need you to have a papa already, sweetheart. We're hoping you might want us to be your mama and papa. Jake watched Evie's face transform as the words sank in. Joy, wonder, and a desperate kind of hope all mixed together in her expression, and he had to blink hard to keep his own composure. You mean it? You really want me? Just me, not because I have Papa Jake with me? We really want you, Mrs. Caldwell said firmly. If you want us to. Evie was quiet for a long moment, thinking it over with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. Jake could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she processed this unexpected turn of events. Papa Jake, she said finally, looking up at him with those serious blue eyes. What do you think I should do? Jake knelt down so he was at her eye level, just as he had been that morning by the fence. But everything had changed since then. This little girl had somehow worked her way into his heart in the space of a single day, and the thought of saying goodbye to her felt like losing a piece of himself. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what was best for Evie. Think, he said carefully, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. That the Caldwells seem like very good people, and I think they would love you and take care of you the way you deserve. But I'd miss you, she said. And Jake had to close his eyes for a moment to maintain his composure. I'd miss you too, sweetheart. More than you know. But Willow Creek, isn't that far from their ranch? Maybe I could come visit sometimes if that would be all right with your new mama and papa. The Caldwells exchanged a look, and Mrs. Caldwell nodded immediately. We'd be happy to have you visit, Marshal Thornton. You clearly mean a great deal to Evie, and anyone who would spend a day pretending to be a little girl's father just to make her happy is someone we'd be honored to know. Then I think, Evie said slowly, her voice growing stronger with each word, I would like to go home with you, if you really truly want me. We really truly want you, Mr. Caldwell said, and his voice was rough with the emotion he was trying to keep in check. The paperwork took another hour, during which time Evie helped pack her few belongings, a worn rag doll named Susanna that Mrs. Hartwell had made for her, 2 dresses, her everyday dress and her Sunday best, a small wooden horse that one of the older boys had carved for her last Christmas, and a book of fairy tales that had been read so many times the pages were soft as cloth. As she packed, she chattered excitedly to Jake about her new home, her earlier reserve forgotten in the face of this unexpected joy. They have horses, Papa Jake. Real horses, Mrs. Caldwell said. Maybe I could learn to ride. And there's a school with a nice teacher, and maybe I really could be a teacher someday, or a nurse, or maybe even both. Jake smiled, caught up in her enthusiasm despite the growing ache in his chest. I think you could be anything you set your mind to, sweetheart. And you'll come visit? You promise? I promise. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. Mrs. Caldwell had produced a warm shawl from somewhere and wrapped it around Evie's shoulders, fussing over her like she'd been doing it for years. Mr. Caldwell had loaded their wagon and was checking the harness, preparing for the journey home. As the sun began to set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink, it came time for the hardest part of the day. Evie had said goodbye to Mrs. Hartwell and the other children, promising to write letters and visit when she could. Now she stood beside the wagon, looking small and uncertain despite her excitement. When it came time to say goodbye to Jake, her brave front finally cracked completely. She threw her arms around his neck and held on tight, and he could feel her small body shaking with the effort not to cry. Thank you for being my papa today, she whispered against his shoulder. It was the best day of my whole life. Jake's throat was so tight he could barely speak. He held her close, breathing in the scent of soap and sunshine that clung to her hair, trying to memorize this moment. Thank you for letting me be your papa, sweetheart. Even if it was just pretend. It didn't feel pretend, she said, pulling back to look at him with those serious blue eyes that had started it all. It felt real. It felt real to me, too, Jake admitted, his voice rough. Mrs. Caldwell approached gently, her own eyes bright with tears. "Evie, sweetheart, we need to get going before it gets too dark. The road can be tricky at night." Evie nodded and let Jake help her up into the wagon. She settled between her new parents, the shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders and her small bundle of belongings at her feet. As they prepared to leave, she leaned over the side of the wagon and beckoned Jake closer. "Papa Jake?" "Yes, sweetheart? Will you still be my pretend daddy sometimes? When you come to visit?" Jake felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. "Always, Evie, whenever you need me to be. And will you tell me stories about when you were little like real papas do? All the stories you want to hear," he promised. As the wagon rolled away down the dusty street, Jake stood watching until it disappeared around the bend where the road curved toward the mountains. The town suddenly felt emptier than it had that morning, and he realized that somewhere in the course of a single day, his life had been completely changed by a little girl who had asked him to pretend to be her daddy. He walked slowly back toward his office, his boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. The jail was quiet, his prisoner from the night before having been released that morning with a warning about drinking too much on Sundays. Jake sat down at his desk and tried to concentrate on his paperwork, but his mind kept wandering to a little girl with blue eyes and wheat-colored braids who was probably seeing her new home for the first time. 2 weeks later, Jake was making his evening rounds when he spotted a familiar figure sitting on the steps of the general store. It was Mrs. Hartwell, and she looked troubled. He changed direction and walked over to her. "Evening, Mrs. Hartwell. You look like you've got something weighing on your mind." She looked up at him with tired eyes. "Oh, Marshal Thornton. I was just thinking about little Evie. I received a letter from Mrs. Caldwell today." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Is everything all right? Is she settling in well?" Mrs. Hartwell smiled, and some of the worry left her face. "Oh yes, she's doing wonderfully. Better than I dared hope, actually. Mrs. Caldwell says she's taken to ranch life like a duck to water. She's already learned to collect eggs from the chickens, and she's been helping with the vegetable garden, and she's absolutely smitten with a gentle old mare named Buttercup." "That's wonderful news," Jake said, relief flooding through him. "What had you looking so worried then?" "Well, Mrs. Caldwell mentioned that Evie talks about you constantly. She's been asking when you're coming to visit, and Mrs. Caldwell was wondering if you'd made any plans. I was worried that maybe you'd forgotten about your promise, or that you'd decided it was better to let her settle in without reminders of her old life." Jake felt a pang of guilt. The truth was, he'd been thinking about visiting every day since Evie left, but he'd been hesitant to intrude on her new life. "I've been wanting to visit, but I wasn't sure if it would be appropriate. I don't want to interfere with her settling in with her new family. Marshal, that child has been through more loss in her short life than most adults face in a lifetime. The one constant she has right now is the memory of the day when someone cared enough to pretend to be her father, just to make her happy. Don't take that away from her by disappearing." Her words hit him like a physical blow. "You're right. I promised her I'd visit, and I should have done it already. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned that they're having a small celebration next Sunday for Evie's adoption becoming official. She specifically asked if you might be able to come, said it would mean the world to Evie." Jake nodded firmly. "I'll be there. Wild horses couldn't keep me away." Sunday arrived bright and clear, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharper and more vivid. Jake had borrowed a horse from the livery stable, a gentle bay mare named Rosie, and set out early for the Caldwell Ranch. The ride took him through some of the most beautiful country in Wyoming, past rolling hills dotted with cattle and wild horses, through stands of aspen trees that were just beginning to turn gold with the changing season. The Caldwell Ranch was smaller than some of the big spreads closer to town, but it was neat and well-maintained. The house was a comfortable two-story structure with a wide front porch and flower boxes under the windows. A barn and several outbuildings completed the picture, and Jake could see horses grazing in the pasture beyond. He was still tying Rosie to the hitching post when he heard a familiar voice call out, "Papa Jake!" He turned to see Evie running toward him from the house, her face radiant with joy. She looked different, healthier, happier, more like the carefree child she should have been all along. Her hair was longer and tied back with a blue ribbon that matched her eyes, and she wore a new dress that actually fit her properly. She launched herself into his arms, and he caught her up in a hug that lifted her clean off the ground. "I knew you'd come," she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I told Mama Martha and Papa William that you'd keep your promise, and you did." "Of course I did," Jake said, setting her down but keeping his hands on her shoulders. "I told you wild horses couldn't keep me away. Look at you. You look like you've grown 2 inches since I saw you last. Mama Martha says it's because I'm eating better. She makes the best biscuits in the whole world, and Papa William taught me how to milk the cow. Do you want to see?" Before Jake could answer, Mrs. Caldwell appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling warmly. "Marshal Thornton, we're so glad you could come. Evie's been talking about nothing else all week." "Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Caldwell. And please, call me Jake." "Only if you call me Martha," she replied. "William's out in the barn with the horses, but he'll be in shortly. Evie, why don't you show Jake around while I finish getting dinner ready?" For the next hour, Evie gave Jake a tour of her new home with the pride of someone showing off a palace. She showed him the vegetable garden where she helped plant seeds, the chicken coop where she collected eggs every morning, and the pasture where the horses grazed. "That's Buttercup," she said, pointing to a gentle-looking chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead. "She's my favorite. Papa William says maybe by next spring I'll be big enough to ride her by myself." They met William Caldwell in the barn, where he was grooming a large black stallion. He was a tall, lean man with calloused hands and kind eyes, and Jake could see immediately why Evie had taken to him. "You must be Jake," William said, offering his hand. "I can't tell you how grateful we are for what you did for Evie. She's told us the whole story, and it says a lot about your character." "I got just as much out of that day as she did," Jake replied honestly. "Maybe more." "She's a special little girl," William agreed. "We feel blessed to have her." They spent the afternoon talking and laughing, sharing stories and getting to know each other. Jake found himself genuinely liking the Caldwells, and he could see that Evie was truly happy with them. She chattered constantly, telling him about her new school, her teacher, Miss Johnson, and her new friend Lucy who lived on the neighboring ranch. "And guess what, Papa Jake?" she said as they sat on the porch after dinner. "I'm learning to read even better than before. Miss Johnson says I might be able to help teach the younger children next year." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I always knew you were smart." As the sun began to set, Jake knew it was time to head back to town. Evie walked him to where Rosie was tied, her steps slower than they had been earlier in the day. "I wish you could stay longer," she said quietly. "I wish. I could too, but I have to get back. But I'll come visit again soon, I promise. Really, you won't forget about me?" Jake knelt down to her level, just as he had that first day by the fence. "Evie, I could never forget about you. You're very special to me, and you always will be." She hugged him tightly, and he held her close, marveling at how much she had changed in just 2 weeks. The scared, serious little girl who had asked him to pretend to be her daddy was still there, but now she was overlaid with the confidence and joy of a child who knew she was loved. "I love you, Papa Jake," she whispered. "I love you too, sweetheart, more than you know." As he rode back toward town under the stars, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning by the fence. He was still the same man, still wore the same badge, still lived in the same small room behind the jail. But everything felt different now. He had a reason to look forward to Sundays, a reason to buy peppermint sticks at the general store, a reason to believe that sometimes, when you took a chance on caring about someone, the universe rewarded you with something precious. 6 months later, spring had come to Wyoming with a vengeance, turning the rolling hills green and filling the air with the scent of wildflowers. Jake had been visiting the Caldwell Ranch regularly, and each time he was amazed by the changes in Evie. She had grown taller and more confident, her face had filled out with good food and steady love, and she had the easy laugh of a child who felt secure in her place in the world. Today was special, though. Today, William was finally going to let her ride Buttercup by herself for the first time. Jake had been invited to witness this milestone, and he wouldn't have missed it for anything. "Are you nervous?" he asked as Evie led Buttercup around the corral, the mare following her like a large, devoted dog. "A little," she admitted. "But Papa William says Buttercup is the gentlest horse in the whole world, and Mama Martha says she won't let anything happen to me." Jake watched as William helped her into the saddle, adjusting the stirrups and checking the girth. Evie looked tiny on the horse's back, but she sat straight and held the reins with confidence. "Remember what I taught you," William said. "Gentle hands straight back, and if you get scared, just say whoa, and she'll stop." "I remember," Evie said, and then she was off, Buttercup walking sedately around the corral with her precious cargo. Jake felt his heart swell with pride as he watched her. This was the same little girl who had stood at the fence 6 months ago, believing she wasn't good enough for anyone to want her. Now she was riding a horse, confident and happy, surrounded by people who loved her. "She's come a long way," Martha said, appearing at his elbow. "She certainly has. You and William have done a wonderful job with her." "We've had help," Martha said meaningfully. "Jake, I hope you know how much your friendship means to her. And to us." Jake nodded, watching as Evie completed another circuit of the corral, her face radiant with joy. "She means the world to me too." "Good, because William and I have been talking and we have something we'd like to discuss with you." Jake looked at her curiously, but before she could explain, Evie called out from the saddle, "Papa Jake, look at me. I'm really riding, I see." "You, sweetheart. You look like you were born to it." After Evie had finished her ride and helped William cool down Buttercup, the four of them sat on the porch sharing lemonade and cookies. The conversation was easy and comfortable, full of the kind of gentle teasing and shared jokes that marked a real family. "Jake," William said during a lull in the conversation, "Martha and I have been talking about something, and we'd like your opinion." "Of course, what is it?" William and Martha exchanged a look, and then Martha spoke. "We've been thinking about making some changes to Evie's adoption papers. Legal changes." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What kind of changes?" "Well," William continued, "we know how much Evie loves you, and how much you mean to her. And we've come to care about you a great deal ourselves. We were wondering, how would you feel about us making this official?" Jake stared at them, not understanding. "Making what official?" "Your relationship with Evie," Martha explained. "We'd like to have the papers changed to list you as, well, as family. Not just a friend, but someone with a real legal connection to her." Jake felt the world tilt around him. "I don't understand. What exactly are you proposing?" "We want to make you her godfather," William said simply. "Officially, legally, with all the rights and responsibilities that come with it." Jake's mouth went dry. "You want to make me her godfather?" "We want to make you her godfather," Martha confirmed. "If something ever happened to us, we'd want to know that Evie was with someone who loves her as much as we do. And we can't think of anyone better than the man who was willing to pretend to be her father, just to make her happy." Jake looked at Evie, who was listening to the conversation with wide eyes. "What do you think about that, sweetheart? Would you like me to be your godfather?" Evie's face lit up like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "That would mean you'd be my family forever, wouldn't it? Not just pretend?" "That's exactly what it would mean," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "Then yes," she exclaimed, jumping up from her chair. "Yes, yes, yes. I want Papa Jake to be my godfather." And so it was that Jake Thornton, who had started that spring morning as a lonely lawman with nothing but his job and his memories, found himself with a family he had never expected. The paperwork was completed a month later, and Judge Morrison himself came out to the ranch to make it official. "Do you, Jake Thornton, swear to care for and protect Evangeline Caldwell as if she were your own child, to guide her and support her and love her for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "And do you, Evangeline Caldwell, accept Jake Thornton as your godfather, to honor and respect him and accept his guidance and love?" "I do," Evie said solemnly, though Jake could see the joy practically radiating from her. After the ceremony, As the sun set over the Wyoming hills, Jake sat on the porch with his newfound family, watching Evie play with a litter of puppies that had been born in the barn. She was laughing and rolling in the grass, completely carefree in the way that only children who feel truly safe can be. "Thank you," he said quietly to William and Martha. "Thank you for what?" Martha asked. "For giving me something I never knew I needed. For trusting me with her." "Jake," William said seriously, "you gave up a day of your life to make a lonely little girl feel special. You didn't have to do that. You could have walked away, but you didn't. That told us everything we needed to know about the kind of man you are." Jake thought about that morning by the fence, about a small voice asking him to pretend to be her daddy for just one day. He thought about how scared he'd been to make that promise, how uncertain he'd been about what he was getting himself into. "No," he said, watching Evie chase a puppy around the yard. "When she first asked me to pretend to be her daddy, I thought it was just for one day. I never imagined it would turn into this." "The best things in life usually happen when we're not looking for them," Martha said wisely. "Amen to that," Jake agreed. As if she'd heard them talking about her, Evie looked up from where she was playing and waved. "Godfather Jake," she called out, trying out the new title. "Come play with the puppies." Jake stood up, his heart full to bursting. "Coming, sweetheart." As he walked across the yard toward the little girl who had changed his life, Jake reflected on the strange turns fate could take. He'd been asked to pretend to be a father for one day, and somehow that pretense had become the most real thing in his life. Sometimes, he thought as Evie grabbed his hand and pulled him down to sit with the puppies, the best families were the ones you chose for yourself, and sometimes when you were very lucky, they chose you right back. That night, as he prepared to ride back to town, Evie hugged him goodbye with the casual affection of a child who knew she'd see him again soon. "I love you, Godfather Jake," she said. "I love you too, Evie. Always and forever, always and forever," she agreed. And then she was running back to the house, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and wanted, and that she belonged somewhere. Jake mounted Rosie and headed back toward Willow Creek, but for the first time, since he'd arrived in Wyoming, he wasn't going back to an empty room and a lonely life. He was going back to a town where he had family waiting, where he had responsibilities that went beyond his badge, where he had a reason to get up every morning beyond just surviving another day. As he rode through the night, with the stars shining overhead and the sound of Rosie's hooves keeping time on the dusty road, Jake thought about the question that had started it all. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy? Just for one day?" The answer, he realized now, was that he hadn't been pretending at all. From the moment he'd knelt down by that fence and looked into those serious blue eyes, he'd been exactly what Evie needed him to be. Not pretend, not temporary, just real, honest love that had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. And as the lights of Willow Creek came into view, Jake smiled to himself and spurred Rosie into a gentle lope. He had a family to get back to, and family was worth riding a little faster for. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.